Welcome to the True North Compliance Podcast, where we discuss regulatory and compliance issues for Canadian business.
Hello, I'm Sean O'Hara, and thanks for listening. The intent of this True North Compliance Podcast is to bring attention to the regulations and compliance issues facing Canadian businesses at all levels of government. We also will talk about the voluntary certifications and designations that a business takes on. We want to know how all this affects the business environment and their ability to operate, and ultimately how it affects the consumer. To launch this podcast, I invited someone to help me co-host and who will be joining me for a couple of more episodes. That's Greg Dent, who will introduce himself shortly. We'll do a bit of a back and forth interview of each other. You can connect with Greg through his real estate business at Remax Select Realty in Vancouver, or through his compliance and documentation online tool for real estate agents, which is www.reallytrusted.com. I hope you enjoy this first of many podcasts.
Welcome to the True North Compliance Podcast. My name is Greg Dent. I want to launch into what it is we're doing here. I think that's an important question that people are probably going to want the answer to. But let's start, I think, with a bit of an introduction as to who we are and maybe why we decided to do this. So, Sean, who are you?
Well, I'm Sean O'Hara. I consider myself a marketer. I've been doing web stuff since the very beginning, 1995. And through a varied, let's say, career, different companies and so on, I started dealing with property listings and realtors and real estate agents in late 95, and was working with a group of people, actually bought their company. They wanted to go on to do other things. They were doing almost strictly real estate. They were actually helped to have the first house in Victoria that was sold strictly online. It was at the time a multi-million-dollar listing. That David Ellis was actually the realtor. We had done a nice feature up for him, and the property sold.
Nice.
That's
back to like when the internet was almost dial-up still at that point. So,
yeah, it was dial-up. That was about 1996. I think that happened, 95, 96.
That is
maybe early 97.
That is the origins of many of our systems that we take for granted today, I would say. Even that's kind of cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
Then in 1997, I bought that business and was running it out of my home, met up with two people who were working in DFH, one of the local real estate offices here in Victoria. And one of them, Roger Whitson, was a former realtor and then got involved in listings data in 1993. And has a ton of knowledge about listings and data and spread on into programming and so on. And in 2001, we set up Radar Hill, a web design company. Over the years, we've gone from dealing with individual real estate agents to agencies, and we've built the back end of the Victoria Real Estate Board and their Strata Docs.
Mm-hmm.
And some other real estate tools over the years, some of which no longer exist and some that people are using in various capacities.
Yeah, I think some of our listeners will probably be interested to hear more about StrataDocs at some point, because that's remains an unsolved issue for many realtors in many places, and yet the Victoria Board, thanks to your group's work on that, is kind of light years ahead, where from my understanding it's a much simpler process. So we'll talk about that at some point, I certainly hope. So
yeah, that would be a great topic.
Yeah.
All right, great. Do you want to tell me about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my background is kind of almost the exact different path to get to where we are today, which is to say I started as an agent 13 and a half years ago, And it was a transition out of out of the not-for-profit sector. So I used to manage summer camp and childcare facilities. So whole different world. My degrees in I have a bachelor in recreation management, and I'm very happy with that degree. But I sometimes like to joke that I have a degree in canoeing, so I'm better at canoeing than anyone I know. Um, that's not true even, unfortunately. But anyhow, point is, became an agent 13 years ago, and I've really enjoyed that job, and I continue to do that today. About 5.5 years ago, I developed an interest in helping agents with some of their technological needs. And to put a really fine point to it, it's something that I've always kind of dabbled with. But 5.5 years ago, we lost control of the real estate council here in BC, and the result of that was a bunch of new forms that we were not used to in our practice. And when I looked at those, I thought there was a real need to make that better for both for agents primarily, and that's where my original focus was. And what I'm actually talking about right now is the inception of Really Trusted. As the other half of what I do right now is I run a company called Really Trusted, and that insight and the work involved in that led me down a path where I've spent a lot of time solving compliance issues for agents and for brokerages in primarily from an anti-money laundering and terrorist financing perspective. That's where a lot of my time is spent now. So under the FinTrack rules and regs, but we've dabbled in some other stuff, and I think we'll continue to dabble in some other stuff as well. So it's but all that's to say, my background is kind of very much the day-to-day experience, the lived experience of a real estate agent, and then I've morphed that into this this kind of more geeky area of where compliance and intersects with the life of a real estate agent, and how my focus really has been in making that compliance easier, better, making sure that we're doing it properly, but also making it that so it's not quite as onerous a burden on the professionals responsible for it. So that's my background. How did you get interested in compliance, Sean? I'd be interested to hear about that, because from website and marketing is still a bit of a jump to compliance.
Yeah, it is a bit of a jump. I met a mutual, I guess, contact friend now, Dan Bennett, way back we were doing the trade show circuit. We had a product that put real estate listings on, I wouldn't even call them smartphones. It actually predates smartphones. And then when we started to go wireless, and then
flip phones. Are you talking about the flip phones?
Well, actually, with Palm Pilots.
Oh, Palm
And
Pilots were
Palms.
great.
And
Yeah,
what
yeah,
did they
yeah.
also call them? PDAs, I think,
Yeah,
Personal
yeah, yeah,
Digital
yeah.
Assistant.
I had a Palm Pilot in university, and I actually diligently used it for my to-do list. I think I was probably the only one, but that's awesome.
Yeah, so the first version, and our business partner Roger would say that our third business partner got annoyed at him when he spent all our company money to buy a Palm Pilot. And then anyway, he went ahead and he developed this. And it was by synchronization, where you basically plug this into the computer and it synchronized and FTP'd in. We actually had instructions. Our realtors would have to use an FTP program to upload. Anyway, so eventually this progressed to being wireless, and we started serving other real estate boards, and I started doing the trade show circuit. I went to the Western Conference, the Real Estate Western Conference in Banff.
Banff, yeah.
Went to the Edmonton trade shows, Calgary and Vancouver, and the Fraser Valley ones. And somewhere in there, I met Dan Bennett, who had a company called Realty Nuance, and who will be a future guest in this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so we stayed in touch. I don't recall exactly which trade show it was, but we would always run into each other and just got to know each other. And then he's in the Fraser Valley, so when I was in his neighborhood, I would go and visit him. And we just got to know each other more and more, and worked on some projects together. And then about a year ago, he came to us and said that there's everything going on with compliance, and it's becoming quite onerous for realtors and for brokers, and the fines are quite an issue. And he noticed that the busiest person in a real estate office tended to be the compliance officer. So even though they have the forms, they have the process, they have really trusted, they have all of these tools, the compliance officer is still the busiest. They have to be available 24/7. Some of them talk about having to be out and doing tasks on their smartphones. One of them told us she goes home at the end of the day, pours herself a glass of wine, sits in front of the computer, and reviews real estate contracts.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what they're also running into was an issue of keeping track of all of these documents for when audits happen.
Yeah.
And he had an idea for a product that would address and keep a strong document trail. I could say a paper trail, but not as much as is on paper anymore. A document trail for everything involved in a compliance and in an audit, so that when the auditors come knocking, then they can prove that not only that they were compliant, but when they did everything that they were supposed to do. So this was an interesting discussion, and we started working on it, and I wanted to find out much more about the issues. So I started talking with other brokers, other agents, and then going on websites and following the news and reading, and find that it's becoming very interesting, I guess. I won't call it an obsession, because it's not at that level, but it's got huge implications. And then in talking with other people, even outside of BC, it seems that the BC real estate industry or market is the most heavily regulated in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And we could probably say in the world, because in this province, we have both the BCFSA, the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, and FINTRAC, and the acronym escapes me, so I'm not going to look it up right now. And that's federal, and their FINTRAC is dealing with money laundering and anti-terrorism, and that's where you saw the opportunity.
Yeah, the Financial Transactions and Report Analysis Center of Canada, by the way. But actually, yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about in all of what you've just said. I think the regulatory burden is something that I spend an awful lot of time talking with an awful lot of people about, because you're absolutely right. The regulatory burden really feels like it's increasing. And whether it is or isn't is something we're going to explore on this with most of our guests, I suspect. And because I think whether it is or isn't increasing is part of the question, and then beyond that is, and it probably is, I think that's fairly fair to say. The question becomes, how important is that regulatory burden, and whether we're delivering a better product for consumers at the end of the day or not is actually what I think should be the measure of whether we're heading in the right or the wrong direction. Well, we're no longer able to take an example. Dual agency is no longer allowed in the province of BC. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think you'd find some real estate agents still at this point, who would think that it's not a good thing. And I would take the position that it's actually a terrific thing. If you look at the issues that it's solved for consumers, it is a tremendously better experience. The consumers are much more protected, just to take one example. But that's an example of regulatory burden, where many in the industry were very opposed to that change when it happened here locally 5 years ago, or 5.5 years ago, whenever that was, where I think the regulatory burden was right. And I think the longer we've had this change in place, the more and more I think people agree with that sentiment, that it probably was the right thing. And so it's really an interesting balance, I think, of burden and benefit, and weighing that all out is certainly an interesting part of the puzzle in my mind, as to how our industry and every industry, in fact, as we think about compliance more generally, how every industry deals with compliance. Hopefully you understand kind of what generally we'll be talking about. And if the name of the podcast wasn't clear enough, compliance. So if you're looking for, Disneyland trips, this probably won't be the podcast that interests you. Now, if you're wanting to think and talk and hear about other people's opinions on compliance, I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, in my informal conversations, a lot with brokers, I've also been asking, how did we get here? And heard various things. And some of the people I spoke with, I'd like to bring in on as guests on this podcast as well.
Yeah. Who else? Who are the other guests that we can kind of announce at this point in time?
Well, our first guest will be Dan Bennett. So
I should jump in to say Dan's actually the reason you and I know each other. In fact,
yes,
Dan. So Dan has a tremendous ability, as do many successful real estate agents, of connecting people, and that's kind of who Dan is at nature. I think is the best way I can put that. So I've known Dan for probably 5 years now. Since I've started working on Really Trusted, he was one of our early-ish customers. And I've kept in touch with him over the years, and so he saw an opportunity to connect us probably 9 months ago or something, which is ultimately how we end up doing this podcast together. So Dan Bennett, that's awesome.
That's right, and then brought us together in Vancouver for a meal.
Exactly,
so we could meet and talk.
Exactly. What other guests do we have lined up?
We have Helen Jones from Jones Co Realty here in Victoria, who has been a realtor since about the 1970s, so a ton of experience. So it'll be fascinating to talk with her.
That'll be interesting to be able to go back to an era pre-even Palm Pilots, when MLS listings were in a little or not so little blue book, and explore how the industry has changed over a long enough period of time to be interesting. I think.
Yeah,
absolutely. Who else?
Even almost pre-MLS too.
Well, pre-digital MLS anyway. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I've even heard old real estate agents talk about the days when they carried dimes, like not even quarters, just dimes. They would go to a payphone, phone their office.
Yeah.
And then phone back later, and that's how they relayed messages. So a pager was probably a huge investment or a huge thing for them.
That was the big technology of the day. Now we're all just so used to being able to email things off of our phone that it's almost comical to think back.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, look, even when I started in real estate, I carried a all-in-one machine in the trunk of my car so that I could print, sign, and scan all at the same spot. And so not that long ago we were doing that. So there you go. What other? And I know
that was a conversation with Dan Bennett of being able to do real estate anywhere, whether it's on the beach or anywhere else.
No, I think that's good.
We have Marty Douglas lined up.
Lovely.
Marty,
from formerly from the BCFSA, now working at BCREA, and a long time, probably very well known, I would assume, from people listening to this podcast, professional standards advisor, and one of the two people who have filled that role over at BCREA now in supporting managing brokers across this province. So that's a great guest, and looking forward to chatting with him for sure.
And we also have his counterpart lined up, Jim McCoggan.
Look at that. We completed the duo.
Yes.
Lovely.
And Jim's in Chilliwack, and Marty is in the Comox Valley, Courtney Comox area.
That's right. Both of those are long-term members of the industry of organized real estate here in BC, and both of them will be able to give us a really cool, broad view of both current and have the historical background to be able to talk with force, honestly. So that'll be really awesome. Lovely.
And one more I've got lined up that's committed is Cale Grieve, who's a local RE/MAX realtor here in Victoria. And because I had spoken to so many brokers and agents who had been doing this, I think if I total up the number of years from everybody I've talked with, it's probably about 200-300 years worth of real estate.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick Cale with less than 10 years in the industry to get his perspective on the regulation and people who haven't quite seen all of the changes that everybody else has.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to not forget that, and that's something that I've talked with newer agents about. How, you know, for those of us who have been doing it long enough to have seen these as changes, then they are changes and therefore are burdens. But for the agent who started last year, having to do a disclosure, representation, and trading services when you first meet a client, that's not new. That's just what you do. That's how real estate is conducted. Having to identify your clients for FINTRAC purposes upfront and early and properly isn't new. That's just the way your business is conducted. And I think it'll be interesting for us to have those conversations with newer agents as well.
There's also other people I've been in touch with who have not committed, so I won't give their names. Some are managing brokers, some are compliance officers. One is a notary, another is a property manager. A couple of people in commercial real estate as well, which also have to respond and deal with regulations.
It'll be interesting to talk with some people from, I think, from the mortgage broker sector. There's a pretty big compliance change happening in their sector come October 11th. Don't quote me on the date, but mid-October-ish this coming year, where they will now be under FINTRAC's rules. And so that's going to be a fairly big shift in the compliance landscape for them. And I know that there's a fair bit of apprehension around what that looks like for the sector.
That would be neat. And possibly somebody from the armored car industry, because starting this summer, FINTRAC will also bring armored cars, private armored cars, the people who haul money.
That's right.
Under their...
The other sector at some point would be the diamond jewelry sector. And the reason that might be interesting, they're also under FINTRAC's rules. And if you look at some of the recent FINTRAC fines that have been published, 2 of them were in the banking sector. But to me, where the real pain point of compliance is, and who I think is interesting, are people who are in smaller businesses. And those are challenges for compliance specifically because they're smaller businesses. The average real estate office just isn't. Actually, very few real estate offices are, $1 million operations where they can spend $1 million on a compliance program. That's just not the reality for any real estate office that I've seen. And similarly, the diamond and jewelry sector has a very similar setup where it's a lot of mom and pop, small time shops who are still subject to all of the same rules and regs that CIBC and RBC are. And CIBC and RBC have literally multi-million-dollar programs in place, and they are getting fined. And we saw those fines published over the last few months. But the diamond and jewelry sector is equally being, let's say, thoroughly looked at by FINTRAC is probably the nicest way to put that for the purposes of this podcast. So.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it.
Thank you. Yeah, I came up with it myself.
Yeah, and a fine of $50,000 can be devastating for them. It would wipe them out.
Mm-hmm.
Even some of the smaller brokerages, some of the real estate brokerages, $50,000 fine, and they're closing shop.
Yeah. One of our clients became our client after the ownership changed because they got a FINTRAC fine that caused the previous owner to say, you know what, we're out. The numbers just don't pencil anymore, so it doesn't make sense. And so they're now our clients, and we have a great relationship with them. But the sad part about that story is that there was an owner of a small business who had to sell essentially, or made the decision to sell anyway, and therefore the burden of compliance is real.
Something I'd like to explore more is, and in some of my conversations, and what a lot of people probably don't realize, is that there are no set, I won't say no set rules. It's not like FINTRAC and BCFSA have outlined exactly what an agent or a business has to do. They have the the law and the various laws that provincial and federal laws that they follow. And then those are interpreted by BCFSA and by FINTRAC. And then when they go into audit, then there isn't a very necessarily clear direction. That's why each real estate agency will have their own procedures and their own ways of doing everything because they're trying to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
One broker was telling me he made all his procedures. He went through an audit and the auditor said, "That's great. You don't have to do this. Everything's good." 6 months later, another auditor came in and said, "You did it wrong. You're not tracking this. You're supposed to be."
Yeah. It's something I hear a lot when I talk with the compliance officers across this country. And what's even more interesting is, so most of my work is in the FINTRAC space, and so I can certainly talk to that end of things. And one of the biggest things I'll hear is we just want an easy way to comply. And the sad reality for those people who are listening and who are looking for that is that's not going to happen. Certainly not from the regulators themselves. Now, that's actually one of the things that we've done in my business with Really Trusted is we have a way for brokerages to subscribe to what we call an all-in-one solution to FINTRAC compliance. But the reason we saw that opportunity, the reason that that's powerful for brokerages is specifically because of all the gray areas involved in a compliance program. A compliance, and ultimately, as much as I hear the pain of that, the reality is that a compliance program has to be specific to a brokerage. And so a regulator just simply can't provide you must do this and you must do that, because every business is different. And as much as people might think they want the regulator to tell them exactly how to do things, the challenge becomes, as soon as the regulator is telling you how to do things, you're no longer actually free to run your business how you feel you should be running your business. And that's equally not a good option, is how I would phrase that, probably. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, that's a neat perspective.
I look forward to some of these conversations in the future. Some of the themes that we've talked about today, these concepts of the burden versus the benefit, the concept of one path versus having to have a customized program, the concept of cost and the value of that cost to the business.
I'd also like to get some of the regulators on as guests as well. They could give their perspective. Yep. All right. It's an exciting adventure. And that's it for today. I guess we say that's a wrap.
That's a wrap, yeah.